they were the only ones in Numbers chapter 26. Let's jump in here. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as I said to Moses. And then he goes into the description of the territory. Hebrew is Yeshua. And Yeshua in Greek is Jesus. And that's the word that is translated, especially in the New Testament, as Jesus. It's very interesting that a man named according to his the Greek version of his name, a man named Jesus, is bringing the Israelites across the Jordan into the promised land, their inheritance. And here God is telling Joshua to take courage. Verse 6, be strong and of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land what I swore to their fathers to give them. This is a promise that extends very far back, all the way back to the man Abraham. And to Abraham, God has told him that his people are going to go into Egypt, and they're going to remain there for an extended period of time, and then they're going to come back from that territory and inhabit the land. And the wilderness wandering kind of put a damper on those plans because of their unwillingness to enter the land initially. And one of the reasons was because of the Anakim being the giants that dwelt in the land. They said, we are but grasshoppers to them. And I bring up that name again because we're going to talk about Anakim some more in the book of Joshua. But and so he is encouraging Joshua to be strong and to have courage. And if he will keep the law and not depart from it, and to meditate on it day and night, right there in verse 8, and observe it, to do according to all that is written in it, then prosperity will come, or blessing will come. Verse 9, have I not commanded you, be strong and of good courage? Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. All right. So, chapter 2 and verse 1, now Joshua the son of Nun sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, go view the land, especially in Jericho. Now, there is a significance to Acacia Grove, in that back in Numbers 25, the Israelites are in Acacia Grove, even as late as Numbers chapter 25. And all throughout the book of Deuteronomy, they're in the Acacia Grove, or Shittim, or the plains of Moab. There's a lot of different ways to say this area. Can anyone remember what the Israelites did initially in Acacia Grove or Shittim in Numbers chapter 25 with certain Moabite people and Midianite people? What's that? It's once you see it or find it, it's a very significant time in the history of the Israelite people. Anybody have it yet? And the reason is, once someone finds it, just shout it out. That from Numbers chapter 22, 23, and 24, God has been doing something very interesting. You got it? Anybody? What happens in Acacia Grove with the Moabites? What's that? Okay, there's a plague, and the plague is the result of, God has sent a plague because of the result of harlotry. Yes, harlotry. In other words, Israel is in Acacia Grove. The Moabites and the Midianites are there. We discover that the Midianites are there. And they are causing or influencing the Israelites to literally bow down and to, what's the word I'm looking for? Unite themselves with Baal. Baal of Peor. Baal meaning Lord, but also the god Baal. And they're uniting themselves through these pagan rituals and these pagan ceremonies that are sexual and perverted and abominable in nature. Okay. What has God been doing to Israel from chapters 20, in chapters 23 and 24? What has he been doing to Israel through Balaam? What's that? Okay. Balaam has been standing there and looking at all of the numbers of the Israelites. And even when these nations, this Moabite nation, has hired Balaam to come to specifically curse the Israelites, Balaam cannot bring himself to curse the Israelites. He is blessing Israel. God has been blessing Israel through Balaam all of that time, and immediately after God has blessed Israel through Balaam, Israel turns around and devotes their life to Baal. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. This is significant. This is extremely significant because this sets the stage for not only who God is and his identity, but the need that Israel is making very clear. And the need is grace. Israel is failing. Israel is failing in every step of the way. And God continues to bless them, which is fascinating. And if you'll note, I didn't actually see this until recently. In a little bit later, chapter 31. In chapter 31 of verse 2, God says to Moses, "Take vengeance on the Midianites for the children of Israel. Afterward you shall be gathered to your people." And so Moses goes to war with Midian because of that whole ordeal. And then notice in verse 7, "And they warred against the Midianites just as the Lord commanded Moses, and they killed all the males. They killed the kings of Midian with the rest of those who were killed, Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian, Balaam, the son of Beor, they also killed with the sword. Now, one of the reasons why they did that, if you'll look down in verse 16, verse 15, they kept the women alive, and Moses said to them, have you kept all the women alive? Look, these women caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the incidents of Peor, and there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. So let's take a step back here. Balaam can't curse Israel even if he wanted to. He has to say what God tells him to say, and what God tells him to say is blessing. But apparently, even in his blessing Israel, he has instructed Midian to go up and cause Israel to sin in this horrible, abominable way. And in response, God brings justice on not just Midian, but Balaam. Right? Does that make sense? It's like sometimes the narrative can seem kind of a little confusing, but does it make sense what's going on here? Balaam has blessed Israel because God made him bless Israel. Israel has fallen to the temptation of the Moabites and the Midianites because Balaam has counseled them to do so. Where did Moses go when he murders the Egyptian? Remember, he runs away. Where does Moses go? Where? Midian? And he took a wife from Midian. He has a father-in-law from Midian. He has family in Midian, doesn't he? And now God has just told Moses to go take out Midian. It's kind of a big deal, I think. It's a very sad thing, perhaps, for Moses, but Moses is a servant of God and the most faithful of all his house, as the Hebrew writer will later say. And when God says bring justice on the Midianites, that's exactly what he does. Anyways, I thought all of that was really fascinating, so I wanted to share that with you. But they're still at Acacia Grove. In other words, they're just now leaving this place that has a lot of history, even in this short amount of time. Good history of blessing, bad history of sin, good history of grace, good history of preaching. Good preaching has come out of this location because of Moses' preaching. And now it's time to move on. So, in chapter 2, it is from here that Joshua sends out 2 men from Acacia Grove to go view the land. And he tells them to go look at Jericho. And while at Jericho, they come across a woman, and what's her name? Rahab, right? And Rahab is very interesting because she gives some insight, very good insight to how the people of the land think about Israel. Because she's not just, when I read what she's saying, I don't read it as just this is her thoughts. She is as a representative of not just Jericho, but the people of Canaan, she is communicating how the Canaanites are viewing this whole invasion. And so let's read her what she says. In verse 8, now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men. Now, notice what she says here. What does she know? She knows this. I know that the Lord has given you the land. That's very significant. If she knows that, don't you think the rest of the Canaanite people know it? Now, why does she know it? And why would the Canaanite people know it? Well, notice what it says. Let's look at this first. That the terror of you has fallen on us. So she knows that God has given the territory to Israel. She knows that. And if she knows it, the Canaanites know it. And also, number two, they're terrified. They're terrified. Israel is a force, apparently has become a force to be reckoned with. And it's one of the reasons why, as we're going to later see, that the kings form these alliances together, because not just one king can do it. They've got to get an entire region to do it. Remember, Israel is coming to populate, inhabit this massive territory. And so the people that dwell in this territory are a massive people. And so this massive people, they are divided into all of these different locations with all these different kings, and they're terrified. Now, we have to put these two things that she knows together. We can't separate them. If you just go, well, they're terrified, you start to feel for them. You're like, oh, this is their home, and here's this other foreign nation that's coming, and to a land that doesn't belong to them. No, you have to put them together. The land doesn't belong to them. The land belongs to Israel. You say, what right do they have to Israel? They actually have every right to Israel. Because Abraham purchased, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they purchased territory there. When Abraham came into the territory, he walked the length and the breadth. This was the ancient way of claiming territory. It belonged to him. Why? Because God gave it to him. But God was going to give it to his inheritance. Or give it to, his offspring. And his offspring was going to inherit it. So the people of the land know that. They know it doesn't belong to them. They know it belongs to someone else. I liken it to, let's say you went on vacation. And you went on a pretty long vacation. Let's say you went on a 2-week vacation. And you came home and all of a sudden you found people living in your house. What are you going to do to that? It's not their house, it's yours. It's time to take legal action because they're somewhere that they're not supposed to be. And so this is the Israelites coming back into their inheritance, and Rahab is communicating on behalf of the Canaanites. We know it belongs to you. If they know that, and they continue to stay in the land, what does that say about them? What's that? I hear mouths moving, but I don't hear sound. And I'm not a great lip reader. Nor can I read lips at all, to be honest. If they know that the land belongs to Israel and they're staying there anyways, what does that say about the Canaanites? What's that? What's that? They're not very bright. Okay. What's that? They're frightened. What'd you say, Paul? They're squatters. Okay. They're trespassers. Why don't they just leave? It's their home. No one's made them yet. Okay. But they know that it belongs to the Israelites. What are they? What's that? They're the what? Defiant. Good. Yeah, they're defiant. They're defiant. Right? They know something. They know better. And let's look at some reasons that they know better. All the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you, for we have. This is why. This is the reason. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. They know that. It's not hidden from them. That did not happen in a vacuum. God did it so the world would know what God was doing. And that God was the one that did it. Right? So you may have your gods and you may have the things that you worship, but this God is the one that took down an entire nation and defied an entire nation, the nation of Egypt. It absolutely had no authority over this God and over these people. And nature, even nature itself, could not keep them from crossing on dry land. So that's one thing that they know. What you did to the two kings of the Amorites who are on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. Okay? You've already took territory. You've already conquered nations. And not only just nations, but nations with, according to paganism, spiritual significance. I mean, Bashan in Canaanite language was serpent, which is kind of ominous to the Israelites, because in the Israelite understanding of creation, you have this serpent that in a way conquers man by influencing them to go against the laws of God, the law of God at that time. Well, anyways, here are the Israelites who are conquering this territory, and God is the one who is doing all of it. Verse 11, and as soon as we heard these things, our hearts, speaking representative of all the other Canaanites, our hearts melted, neither did there remain any more courage in any because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. He's God of the living, and below was always considered to be the location of where the dead were. He's the God of the living, he's the God of the dead. God is the God of all. Right? In the Canaanite, Phoenician, even Babylonian mythologies, there was this belief that you had you had El, who is the Most High God, and then you had Baal, who is the son of Dagon, and that's going to have Phoenician or Philistine significance when we talk about the Philistines in 1 Samuel. But Baal was the rider of the clouds. He was the god of thunder, right? And Baal fought. Baal was he fought against Mot, or the god of the dead, and he died. But he overcame death, right? He was raised from the dead, and he conquered death. Okay? Therefore, he is also the God of the underworld. And so Baal has a lot of stuff going on in this territory. He's a big name. But Baal is not the God of the living and the dead. He's losing. God is the God who is superior and supreme. Pharaoh asks, who is God? How does he have any significance? He's the most significant. And I'm not giving any legitimacy to these pantheons or anything like that. All I'm saying is, if you want to argue against God physically, you've got the army of Israel who are walking on behalf of God. But if you, even spiritually you want to fight against God, God is winning. He is supreme and he is superior. And Rahab is saying, we know this. Not only does Rahab know this, but later we're going to see a conversation with the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites know this. For the sake of time, chapter 9, verse 9, when asked, where do you come from and who are you? They say, from a very far off country your servants have come because of the name of the Lord your God. The reputation here, they've heard about it. For we have heard of his fame and all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who is at Ashtaroth. Therefore our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, take provisions with you, anyway, so on and so forth. And they make this alliance with Israel. Why? Because they're terrified of Israel. And they know what Israel's there to do. What God does not happen in a vacuum. What God does is so that all the world will see. Why? Because all the world is his ambition. All of the world that were dispersed at the Tower of Babel. All the world that has turned their lives over to paganism and all of these different pantheons and pagan deities. God wants the world to see that he is the most high God and the supreme of all. And reigns supreme and has all authority. Why? Because one day they're going to have a chance to have access to him. In other words, there are going to be Gentiles that have a vested interest in the Messiah. God has not given up on the world. It is through these Jewish people that he is going to make it possible that all nations of the world might be saved. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, or one and unique Son, that whosoever should believe in him would not perish, but have eternal life. And so none of this is happening in a vacuum. So they go in, they cross the Jordan, they leave stones in the waters so that when their children ask about it, they have an answer. This is what God did. Don't forget, remember. It also takes you back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and when after the giving of the Shema, a passage I cite very frequently because it was so important to the Jewish people, but also it is on which all of the laws hang, Jesus says, and it is, as he would put it, one of the two greatest commands, to love God. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 6, the command is to now teach your children about it. And so that's now what these stones are. And so Joshua is becoming one like Moses, who is leading the Israelites in this way. Chapter 4 and verse 24, just speaking to what I was talking about before, that all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God. Now the question is, what are you going to do with that fear? To the Israelites, it was a motivating fear because they wanted to do the will of God. But to the Canaanites, it was a crippling fear, and it made them stubborn and hard-hearted. And they took their stubbornness to their grave. Apologies. All right. So it is here in chapter 5 that the manna ceases. They eat the fruit of the land. They are circumcised for the first time. This new generation is circumcised for the first time. let's see. Verse 9 of chapter 5, then the Lord said to Joshua, this day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore the name of this place is called Gilgal to this day. And, it says, I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So they named it Gilgal, which is that idea of rolled. The significance of this, I think, is important because there was still a part of Egypt that they brought with them. This thing, this part of that was depicted in their body that did not express that they were a holy people, but that just made them look like the Egyptians where they came from. Remember, one of the things that we talk about is, and I say this, I've said this quite a bit, but I'll say it again. It was about not just about getting Israel out of Egypt, it was about getting Egypt out of Israel. There has to be a difference and there has to be a change. And of the Jewish people, there was an external change that took place, a surgical change on the external that took place. But it is supposed to emphasize that a spiritual surgical procedure is taking place, and that of a spiritual circumcision. And the significance of that we have to see. We have to see it. Because this spiritual purity and holiness is just as true now as it ever was. It's why Paul in the book of Colossians talks about the circumcision that's not made with hands. And well, let's just go look at it. In him you were also circumcised with circumcision not made with hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh with the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you also raised with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead, and you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all your trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he's taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. And so this purifying, this cleansing, this holiness that's taking place is that he's requiring of the Jewish people is something that takes place in us when we're baptized, and God, without hands, circumcises us. Something that he does in a way that we ought to live, in a way that we ought to walk. But that same standard of righteousness was expected of the Israelite people. That same spiritual surgery and that same heart change. Because all of the problems that are going to exist in the Israelites is going to be a heart problem. And one of those is that of Ai. Achan is a descendant of Judah. And Achan, when they go into Jericho, brings back the spoils of Jericho, and he hides them in his tent. We all know the story of Achan, and we know what happens to him. He and his family are put to death because of what he does. And a lot of the times we read that and we think, wow, that's a really harsh punishment. But he's not just any descendant of Judah. He's a descendant of Judah, specifically descendant of Zerah. If you remember Judah, and he has two sons with Tamar. Tamar she prostitutes herself because Judah fails to give her to his third son. He doesn't give her to his first son because his first son is wicked and God puts him to death. He doesn't give it to his second son because his second son knows that the inheritance is not going to go to him. It's going to go to the child, and therefore he does not impregnate her, and so God kills the second son. And so Judah fails to give his third son with Tamar, and so Tamar prostitutes herself, and with Judah himself has twins. One of the children's name is Perez, and the other child's name is Zerah. Now, if you go to Matthew chapter 1, you're going to find one of those names, but you will not find the other. The one you will find is Perez. Perez is in the direct lineage of Jesus. Because just like God chose Jacob and did not choose Esau, Jacob chose Perez and did not choose Zerah. And it's here in Joshua chapter 7 that the line of Zerah, the lineage of Zerah, ends. This is God's choice. The Messiah would not come through Zerah. The Messiah would come through Perez. And so, with all of the kings that Joshua conquers, he hangs them, he puts his foot on their neck, on their head, and he does so with Ai and hanging him on a tree. He does so with the kings of the Amorites. Adonai-Zedek being the king of Jerusalem in Joshua chapter 10. There's another king in Genesis chapter 14 whose name ends with Zedek. Can you remember his name? Melchizedek, right? Now we have Adonai-Zedek, who's the king of Jerusalem, and he is not like Melchizedek. And he goes to fight against Israel. He conquers the south. After he has removed the heads of the cities, he goes and conquers the cities. He does so with the south. He does so with the north. I'm trying to see if there's talk about that, but Hazor in chapter 11 is the head of all those kingdoms. I would like to end with this thought, and then, but I do want to make sure that there's no others that I want to cover. Yeah, because after all of this, he starts dividing the territory, and we won't go into details on that unless anyone has a question about it. But the Anakim are here. We'll cover this in chapter 14, verse 13. And Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb the son of Jephunneh as an inheritance. Hebron therefore became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite to this day, because he wholly followed the Lord God of Israel. And the name of Hebron formerly was Kirjath Arba. Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. Then the land had rest from war. And it's the Anakim was the reason why the Israelites didn't go in the land to begin with. But now we see that the Israelites are conquering the Anakim. And the only exception, as it says somewhere, I guess I didn't write that down. The only exception to the residents of the Anakim are those that dwell in Philistia. In chapter 11, verse 21, at that time Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, which are all the territories that he cut them off. Verse 22, none of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. These are Philistine cities. What Philistine giant do we know of? Yeah, Goliath. Right? So this makes sense to us. Okay, let me close with this idea, and then real briefly. When God curses the serpent, there's this terminology that he uses of crushing the head of the serpent or bruising the head of the serpent. And it's very interesting, and then I want to bring it up in Joshua because we're going to see it some more in 1 Samuel. When the kings are conquered, there's something associated with the head and or the neck. Hanging on the tree, curses everyone who hangs on the tree. He puts his foot on the neck. He puts his foot on the head. And this is to show that there is dominance here, of course, among the ancients. But I think it's even more than that, and there's even spiritual significance there. And that is that God is going to conquer his enemies. And so this theme, and you can see it all throughout the Psalms, is that God conquers the enemies of the children of God. David's enemies, for example, God's going to conquer them. And that is very important for us, very significant. Because who or what is our greatest enemy? What's that? What's that? Satan? Good. What else? Sin? Ourselves? Yeah. Okay. What else? Satan, sin. The wages of sin is death. We need to know, we need to know that God defeats his enemies. We need to know that he puts his foot on the head of those that try to curse his children. Not people so much as it was then, but now it's sin and death can no longer conquer us anymore if we turn to him, our deliverer, because God delivers his children from their enemies. All right. Let's close with a song and one final prayer.
Let's close with number 839. During the song, if you need to partake of the Lord's Supper, if you'll go downstairs, you'll be served there. When all of God's singers get home, first and last verses, and Brother Lynn Stevens will lead us in our closing prayer. Let's be standing, please. What a song of delight in that city so bright will be wafted neath heaven's fair dome. How the ransomed will raise happy songs in his praise when all of God's singers get home. When all of God's singers get home. When never a sorrow will come. There'll be no place like home. When all of God's singers get home. Having overcome sin, hallelujah, amen, will be heard in that land o'er the foam. Every heart will be light, and his face will be bright, when all of God's singers get home. When all of God's singers get home. When never a sorrow will come. There'll be no place like home. When all of God's singers get home.
Father, we just come to you again tonight. Thank you so much. Gathering in here, your word, the power that you have, Father. Just amazing that you created all this knowledge. You control us today, Father. Help us do everything, Father. You said Father, speak to those who are not good. Stay, man, Father, those who can't get out. Speak down to us, Father. Put her down. Father, speak to us as we go. Our homes, bless us, comfort us. Keep us safe. Christ,